Hey, it's Dr. Mike T. Nelson here, and coming up, I've got an awesome interview I did with my buddy, Dr. Eric Helms, all about flexible dieting. I wanted to get him on here because when I think of flexible dieting, he is literally the first name that pops into my head. I've known Eric for many years now. He's been around the fitness industry since the early 2000s. For most of his career, he's been a coach over at 3DMJ, known as 3D Muscle Journey, working with drug-free strength and physique competitors of all levels. And Eric himself is also a competitive athlete. He has his pro status with the Professional Natural Bodybuilding Association and has competed at the international level as an unequipped powerlifter. He has also published multiple peer-reviewed articles in exercise science and nutrition journals, and specifically on the topic of flexible dieting. He has a Bachelor of Science in Fitness and Wellness. He's got 2 masters, one in exercise science and a second in sports nutrition. And he recently completed his PhD in strength and conditioning. Is currently a research fellow at AUT at the Sports Performance Research Institute over in Kiwiland, New Zealand there. So we had a great chat about all things related to flexible dieting, even getting into amounts of protein that may be useful, and a bunch of other topics. We do talk a fair amount about competitors and people who are really pushing the envelope more on the extreme side, especially from a physique or a competitive athlete who's in a weight class sport. But a lot of the concepts we talk about are also very relevant to, the average or general population, which I don't mean in a derogatory sense at all, but people who have a little bit less experience. I always find that looking at the extremes that some people have to go to does provide you information kind of about the means. So the old saying, the extremes inform the means, I think is very applicable here. So check it out. Great interview here with the one and only Dr. Eric Helms.
Hello, sir. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you very much for doing this. Greatly appreciate it. When I think of the word flexible dieting, I was trying to think, I'm like, who pops into my head right away? And I was like, oh, Eric. So I thought, this will be great.
I will take it.
Yes.
Cool.
Because I know this is something you've talked about for a long time, both experience-wise, sort of in the trenches, and I know you've also done some published literature looking at that area also. But to start it off, I guess to kind of make sure we're all on the same page, what do you consider the definition of flexible dieting?
Yeah, I think that's probably the most misunderstood portion of it. And the definition of flexible dieting to me is when you have a flexible approach to restraint. So it's more about a approach to dieting rather than a specific type of dieting. And I think in the mainstream, if you could even call it that, if it fits your macros, which is more of a methodology of dieting versus an actual mindset around it, has become synonymous with flexible dieting. And I don't think that necessarily is always flexible. Because I think we've probably all seen people who are super anal retentive about how they do if it fits your macros, and their food scale is there always with them, and if they're chasing down that last spring,
I've seen.
Exactly. So that in and of itself can become I'd say it's something that's quite rigid, which is something I think a lot of people don't realize.
Gotcha. And other than if it fits your macros, which is kind of more of a methodology, are there any other things that kind of jump to your mind that the listeners may be familiar with in terms of a more flexible approach, or like an example of a flexible versus a non-flexible approach?
Yeah, I mean, there's some really, really good ones out there that have been around for ages. Like Weight Watchers is actually one of the most common, what I would recognize as a flexible approach to nutrition that is actually one of the more successful quote-unquote diets out there. And really, it's just kind of like a support group. They weigh in, they have a basic calorie exchange, and they have systems for accounting for eating more or eating less on a day-to-day basis, and quantifying exercise and all of that. And really, what flexible restraint comes down to, because that's where the research came from, is they were able to, group led by Westenhofer, they looked at the differences in how people restrain themselves. So how they were differentiated on this questionnaire into either having a quote-unquote flexible or rigid restraint mindset. And that really came down to whether or not they had black and white thinking around their diet. Like if I blow it at breakfast, does that mean I'm screwed for the rest of the day? It doesn't matter what I do, or even till the next day. Well, probably not. Obviously, if you were to adjust your calorie intake or just moderate the size of your subsequent meals, you could make up for that. And people who had a flexible mindset realized that and incorporated it into their approach, while those who had a rigid mindset did not. And I think that is the big kind of broad idea of what flexible dieting is.
Gotcha. And it's very interesting that you mentioned mindset, because we all know sort of those people who, and it's, you know, it's a general over, I guess, estimation per se, but very, very, very rigid, right? And I tend to see those people that if the littlest thing goes wrong, then, oh my gosh, everything, it seems like it takes so much work for them to get back on track. And then you've got the other extreme, which we can argue maybe not so good. People that never really had a plan anyway. They're just almost so flexible that, Twinkies for breakfast, that's good. Bagels, it's like a gram of protein, it's okay. You know, they've almost gone like the other extreme the other way. Any sort of advice of how do you find that sort of happy place in between where you want enough constraints so that they're getting closer to their goals, but at some point you don't want to, I always tend to diverge into engineering and thinking about like over-constrained systems and how they just tend to blow up at some point.
Gotcha. Yeah. I think that's a good analogy, looking at it from an engineering perspective. And you're 100% correct. And the way I normally position it is that having structure is not the same thing as being rigid. So I always advise people to take a structured approach to creating flexibility. So embedded in the actual quote-unquote rules or systems that you have to define what is, on or off the diet, if you will, you have continuums and ranges. So, for example, instead of giving, like we'll take an if it fits your macros approach. Sometimes people will post their macros and be like, yeah, I have, 54 grams of fat to eat today, 203 grams of carbohydrate, and 193 grams of protein. And that boggles my mind. It's like, well, why don't you just round to the nearest 5? Like, does the 1 gram matter?
Bro, those 3 grams, man. That's those 3 grams of carbs. That's gonna do it.
That's right. So I think people should be working in ranges. Like figure out a target that's rounded to the nearest 5, and then plus or minus 10 grams at least. Or look at just protein and calories, since we know that from a dieting perspective, most people, if they are healthy and if they don't have extreme goals, we perfectly fine filling in their fats and carbs as they desire, and so long as they have a effective amount of protein and the appropriate calorie amount. So maybe it's just protein within 10 grams of a target, and then a plus or minus 100 calories from their target for the day. Other systems that I put in are in place to help people deal with curveballs that come with life. So, for example, I use a rule called 20% borrowing, where you can take up to 20% of calories from one day and not eat them and distribute them to another day. And the reason I have a cap there is just to prevent, creating its own problem.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you overeat, and the next day you're like, oh crap, I've got to just have protein today. And then you have the 3 protein shakes, and that's like literally like only like a couple hundred calories, and then oh my god, you're hungry, so you binge the next day. It becomes this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. But if you have some type of limit on that's reasonable, you can avoid that. Another one I do for people who use refeeds is I just call them roving refeeds. So for example, instead of it always being let's say Friday, if a friend unexpectedly comes in from town and asks you to grab dinner with them, that's okay. Just move it on to whatever day they're coming in, and that's your refeed for that week. That way you at least preserve the weekly calories. And this is kind of based on the notion that we want to look at our nutrition plan as having a hierarchy of importance. That calorie balance probably comes first, versus little things like nutrient timing or the macronutrient breakdown, which are less important. And if that's a if those changes are in service of something that's more important and in the priority list, then that's a good change because it allows you to stay on the diet, be flexible, and still live your life.
I like that. And in terms of a breakdown, do you look more at a daily average, a weekly average, a monthly average? Because I think for clients who are much more on I call them the accountants, right? They want to make sure that they've accounted for everything, and you can usually tell right away by the amount of questions you get. One of the famous ones, and I know you've gotten this a lot, is, well, the values there, was that cooked or uncooked? And, well, what if I processed it this way or that way? And you're talking like gram differences, Does it matter? Do you look at a total kind of a running average? Do you look at a daily, a weekly? How do you, in your brain, kind of look at that and kind of frame that up?
Good question. Yeah, so typically with my clients, now take in mind that I'm almost always working with competitive strength athletes in a weight class restricted sport.
So you're more on the extreme end of the spectrum.
Right, yeah. But I still use these same systems with them. It's just a matter of I have, extreme goals require extreme effort sometimes. So I'm going to ask them to be within, 5 or 10 grams in their macros on a day-to-day basis, but certainly not the only way to do it. So with my clients, just to give you some kind of idea, I'm looking at a 7-day average of their body weight. And then I'm probably not making changes until I'm looking at trends over 2 weeks or sometimes longer with women, especially if they have a menstrual cycle that has a significant change in their body weight. And then as far as are they, sticking to the quote-unquote plan, I'm looking at them being within 10 grams of their macros on a day-to-day basis. And then when they have to shift and pivot in response to things and either go protein and calories or just calories, which should happen sometimes but not consistently and always, then I'm just making sure they're staying within the rules, not borrowing more than 20%, the refeed's moved, or we've shifted to just protein and calories for the day or just calories. And so long as, that's happening the appropriate proportion of the time, like, let's say 80% of the time we're sticking to hitting the macros, and then 15% of the time we go protein and calories when we have to pivot for something, and then every once in a while we just go calories, or it's just we screwed up and we have to adjust on subsequent days. Then that's how I kind of look at adherence, I guess you could say, and the metrics I use to assess progress, at least in terms of body weight. But of course, if I'm working with a competitive physique athlete, then I'm looking at their pictures as well. That's going to be a better indication at a certain point whether or not they're improving.
Gotcha. And you had mentioned just body weight. Is there any particular reason you don't use body composition?
There is, and it's largely a very difficult measure to get consistently. I think, especially when you're online coaching, like I don't have the opportunity to actually put hands on my client and check skin caliber measurements or do tape measurements, which I'm pretty competent at doing. I've certified that for research, but I don't think I knew the level of precision that was required to have nice, reliable measurements on that until I actually got certified as a researcher through ISAC. But back when I was doing calipers regularly as a personal trainer, back say 2005 to 2010, I thought I was good, but man, I wasn't. And I think then you think, okay, well, when someone gets these measurements on their own, it's either going to be like them pinching themselves or just going to a random personal trainer. So I think that data is suspect a lot of the times. And I think if I have a visual and if I have their performance metrics, because I typically am always working with someone who I'm managing their training as well. And if our training is doing what we want and they're looking better and they're losing weight, it's a fair chance that the vast majority of what they're losing in terms of weight is going to be body fat, and I think that's kind of the way I look at it. And I'm also looking at subjective recovery and sometimes objective recovery, or at least I should say quantified recovery markers from subjective questions. So I'm kind of looking at all of the aspects of it, and in the end, like whether you get on the platform and you're trying to hit PRs in your weight class that you just cut to, or whether you're getting on the stage and you're trying to get placed as high as you can against a bunch of other physique competitors, you're never going to get a white light or a placing because because of your body composition. You're going to get it because of how much you lifted in your weight class or what you look like, you know. So in the end, the direct metric we're looking at in a strength athlete's performance, and the direct metric for a physique athlete is the way they look. So in the end, I think people would be like, oh, well, you can't just measure body weight. You got to be looking at body comp. Well, actually, I'm looking at the most important metrics, what they're actually going to be judged on. So I'm pretty confident.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned body comp, because when I was doing my PhD at the University of Minnesota, we had this lab that I was the TA for 3.5 years, and it would come around every once a quarter and would be for 2 weeks because the groups were split. And so for 2 weeks a quarter, I would do multiple body compositions, right? So we'd run them through bod pod, we'd do underwater weigh-in, we'd have them do, we had a DEXA, but that was in a different building, and we'd have them do skin calipers. And it was always just such a debacle, you know, and these are students who don't have any experience, you know, and you walk them through how to do it, and just looking at the numbers across the board was crazy. And even with when I was doing it, like even now, like you, I don't do skin caliper readings anymore. I haven't done them for consistently probably for 2 years, so I know I completely suck at it right now. But I think it's a underappreciated thing about how much skill there is involved in that, and how much that may be different maybe from one skilled person to the next, and trying to make up for those differences. And even once you get into the weeds and you start looking at, you know, DEXA for body composition, it's good, but it was initially designed for bone. It can be plus or minus, you know, 1, 2, maybe even more percentage. So I think we have in our head a lot of times that, body composition is going to be this awesome thing, and if we could, you know, maybe toss everyone in an MRI, it'd be useful. But in practice, I just don't find it that useful, and I've tested all sorts of, you know, from bioimpedance to everything under the sun to handheld stuff, and similar to you, I'm kind of back to, pictures, maybe some measurements, daily weight if I can get it, performance, you know, and you're just kind of thinking, okay, are they moving in the right direction or not?
Yeah, totally agree. And if I can just tangent with you, like so for my master's, I ran a study where we looked at changes after 2 weeks of dieting on different protein intakes, but that's not really the point. What we did was we measured changes in skin fold thicknesses with a pretty damn good ISAC person, and they had a technical error of measurement of 0.4 millimeters on average across 8 sites. So, you know, like if you were to assume the worst case kind of error, you know, that's like 3.2 millimeters off on their total 8-site measurement, you know, plus or minus 3.2 millimeters. That's like really accurate, you know.
Oh, yeah.
But then when you plug that into an equation, and I did this on purpose, I chose 3 different equations that I found put out vastly different numbers. I had one guy who measured at 10% on one, 15% on another, and 20% on another. Yep. So he had the spread of, you know, on the internet, basically. He had the spread from pretty damn lean where you should be to average to you're getting too fluffy, you should cut, you know. So it's just you're exactly right in that some of these methods really put out odd numbers. And with DEXA, now that I've seen more and more commercial, this is especially big in Australia, commercial DEXA scanners where they're giving feedback to clients. I think the quality control there is probably less than it is in a research setting. Yeah. And I've seen some super wacky numbers come out. And I think it's because they don't ensure for hydration status, they don't make sure you're on the same position on the table, all those standardization procedures which have been well established to make DEXA accurate aren't there. And I'm seeing numbers that really make no sense, you know. So I think just a little cautionary tale to anybody who's out there, really ask yourself, what are you getting from this, especially a physique competitor. You know, you're going to diet until you're lean enough to get on stage, and then if you get a DEXA scan just for fun, you're going to think it doesn't matter. You're like, whatever, I'm not going to pay attention to the number. I'm just going to make sure I look lean enough. But I can tell you, every single time I have a physique competitor who gets a DEXA scan and they don't like the number, it sticks with them and it gets in their head, and they can't help but they're asking, Coach, I really thought we were doing a good job of maintaining muscle mass. I don't know, my performance is good. I guess we just screwed something up. We got to change it next time. And I'm like, you know, if you'd never gotten a scan, you wouldn't think there's any problem. And like, we don't know the error measurement there. So Save yourself the hassle. Just keep focusing on your pictures, your body weight, performance, and you'll get on stage just fine.
Yeah, I did an experiment where during a 1 week period of time, I measured my body fat by, I think I got 5 different methods. I had a DEXA, I had a bod pod, I had underwater weighing, I had 2 bioelectrical impedance, and a skin fold. And the range on that was literally, if you talk about just the range and sort of body fat percentage, was about, from one low to the highest low, 15%. Right, so let's say if our norm, right, is just 15%, I could be almost no body fat at all, up to 30%.
So you're either Bruce Lee or you're obese, but we don't know, somewhere in that range.
Right,
yeah.
and it's like, holy crap. It's like I knew it was probably going to come at a pretty wide range, but yeah, and even like if I have clients who do DEXA scan, which in the U.S. is becoming more popular, there's kind of roving DEXA scans, and even not so much bod pod, but underwater weighing and things like that. I'll tell them, I'm like, okay, go to the exact same place, try to make sure it's a university setting if you can, not a roving unit, all the kind of stuff to try to make it as standardized as possible. And even then, if they have an unlimited budget, I'm like, once or twice a year, not like...
Yeah, exactly.
I had a couple of clients early on who were doing it every month, and it was just a debacle, right? Because I'm like, if you're, like, same thing, right? Performance went up, you look better, you feel better. I can guarantee, if you're a smaller petite female, you did not lose 4 pounds of lean mass. It probably didn't happen. If it did, I'd like to know where it went and how that happens. But yeah, so anyway.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah. So takeaway from all this is I think people just spend some time looking at what measures do you want to use, which ones can you get rather easily. Do you do anything with people who get on a scale, for example, if you're using body weight and you're tracking it at a higher frequency, they get on the scale and they just totally lose their mind and everything else just kind of spirals downward. Do you do anything different in that case?
Definitely. You got to have a backup plan there. And this happens both, in my experience, both with general pop and with bodybuilders. So with bodybuilders, fortunately, they're low enough in body fat, especially typically by the time the scale starts messing with their head, where you can just go by visual changes so long as they're taking pictures or video in the same location, in the same time of the week, so there's similar carbohydrate intake and all the things that should affect their appearance. So with the bodybuilder, I can shift towards, all right, I'm going to make an adjustment by looking at pictures from like 3 weeks ago and comparing them to now. And I think I'm pretty confident in that. But with general pop, you have to have a little more tricks up your sleeve because you won't always see those visual differences when you're going from, say, 25% body fat to 23. Like, that's great progress, but it's not going to look that different. So I think you have to have things in place. Andy Morgan, I know he likes to use a waist measurement, and he teaches his clients how to use that pretty effectively. I think you could do measurements, and that would work pretty well. I know a lot of coaches who do that with success. They just have to make sure that they give very clear instructions on how to take those measurements. I've seen really more simplistic ones too. Just how tight do your clothes feel right now on a scale of 1 to 5? And I think that's really good because it focuses on something that is easy to gauge and is relevant, and kind of how someone feels. And so long as they're still making steady progress on all the process side of it, I think that's actually a good focus, because many times with general pop, it's like the loss of weight on the scale, the amount, that should be happening, but really it's more about ingraining a healthy lifestyle and knowing that if you do that, they'll make some type of progress towards their goal, even if it's not as fast as they would like it. If you can get somebody eating 3-4 servings of vegetables and fruit each a day, drinking at least 2 liters of water a day, eating a high protein diet, eating in a mindful manner, not snacking between meals, and exercising regularly, then things are going to improve. And whether the scale is reflecting that at any given time, it doesn't really matter, and it may just be more stressful for the person. But you do want to know it at some point just to make sure that the actual energy intake you prescribe is appropriate. So it's good feedback to have, just to make sure that something like that, either a measurement or how tight clothes are fitting, is utilized. So yeah, those are all useful ones to do. The only time I can't really do that is with a weight class restricted strength athlete. Like, I can give them some time off the scale, just like, hey, don't worry about it. I'm confident you're losing weight at this calorie intake, and the scale's really messing up your head. So let's just take a week off the scale. Let your stress levels come back down, and we'll step back on it. But unfortunately, when the target metric that we have to ensure is below a certain level for you to compete is scale weight, then we've got to figure out some way to do it. I can reduce the frequency. Maybe we get Monday, Wednesday, Friday scale thing, so it can only ruin your day on 3 days instead of 7. But yeah, when I've got someone who actually has to do a weigh-in, that's a metric we can't avoid. I have used tricks though. I've had when you have a partner, your significant other would simply just look at the scale weight, write it down, and then you just send me all the numbers at the end of the week. Mm-hmm. So you'd only have one exposure to the numbers. I've had to do that just to save people from themselves. So that's a unique trick. But that can be a problem.
Yeah, I'm waiting for an app. So there's an idea for people who create apps of a scale where I can change the mode where it'll just say measurement good, and it'll just send it to me electronically. So basically like what you were doing. So that way the person just doesn't have that number and loses their mind and all that kind of stuff. But any app people out there, let me know.
There you go. Just all you need was like a scale with a Bluetooth thing in it, and it just records it in a notepad in your phone, and then it locks it until Saturday or something like that. So you can't even look at the data until Saturday when you have to send it to your coach.
Yeah. I think that would be useful for a lot of stuff. There's one thing I do with people that are kind of transitioning out of competition is, can you go for a couple days, couple weeks, and do the behaviors that you've learned, but we're kind of pulling back on the direct measurements, right? Maybe you don't send pictures for a while. Maybe you don't get on the scale. And then can you get on the scale and you're still within the range you want to be, right? So talking about a flexible approach, you're kind of going off the other side a little bit. Do you ever have any people that have kind of transitioned from, say, being a weight class athlete or a physique athlete, and now they're saying that I'm going to kind of retire, but I still want to live kind of a healthy lifestyle? Are there things you would do to still have them follow a flexible approach, but obviously they would not have to be so strict since they're not doing a competition?
Actually, with the modern standards for conditioning and natural bodybuilding, or bodybuilding in general, I should say, you get to do that almost every season. Because for one, you've got to diet them down to very lean levels, and I'm telling you, like, the average diet length these days is 6 months, and it's not uncommon at all to be doing 7 or 8 months to get someone truly to the level of conditioning where they're competitive. And what that means, if you look at the research on how long does it actually take to recover from pushing yourself down that low in body fat to the point where, you're not having food cravings, and your hormonal levels for like hunger and satiety are normalized. Metabolic rates back to where it should be, energy expenditures more or less what it would be predicted for your body weight, and menstrual cycle returns, all that stuff. Sometimes it can be half as long as you dieted, and obviously that's affected by the approach you take. But let's just say you did a great job and you ate. You didn't try to keep dieting afterwards, more or less. You dieted for 6 months, and then 2 months later you're feeling good. That's 8 months out of the year before the next season starts. So you got 4 months to make improvements as a seasoned natural bodybuilder. You're going to need more than that. So with most of our clients, they're taking an approach to competition of competing every other year. So they might compete 2012, 2014, 2016, and get basically a year to year and a half long off season where they're not prepping almost every time. And that does require a transition back to being, I wouldn't say normal, but as normal as a bodybuilder gets in the off season. And there is definitely a process there, and that's one of the hardest times for competitors. So what I use is exactly that, a tapered approach towards reducing the number of constraints to the absolute minimum while still ticking all the boxes for what we think would optimize an off-season, which is actually a small number of boxes. It comes down, so we're tapering our cardio down to a minimal amount, typically often zero, unless they're just a completely sedentary person, and we know it would probably just be better for their overall health and recovery. Likewise, the weigh-ins don't need to be nearly as frequent as, for after you've kind of regained some of that baseline body weight and we've got you back up to like your low-end settling point. That's when we go, right, we don't need to weigh in that frequently. We're looking at gaining maybe a pound a month over the next 12 months, to try to mitigate fat gain. So do we need to do a daily weigh-in? Probably not. Maybe you weigh in twice a week and we look at the aggregate over 3 weeks, So weigh-in frequency goes down. We'd start shifting away from tracking macros, and I just start looking at the output. My goal is to get you to the point where we're just looking at body weight changes as okay, that's our surrogate for energy balance, and are we in an appropriately small surplus? And then we can do little audits here and there based on what you think you are good and bad at tracking. So I'll use myself as an example. I keep a running tally of my protein intake in my head, because if I don't, I'll actually fall a little short. And then I have systems in place to make sure I get enough fruit, vegetables, and water. Because those are the things that if I just kind of auto-regulate it completely and just use body weight and my hunger and satiety signals, that will start to be a little low. And a lot of this process, like I said, is actually teaching the person how to use hunger and satiety again, because they ate by the numbers for so long, because they had to. The last half of prep, if you listen to your hunger and satiety signals, that wouldn't go well, right? You have all the hunger and no satiety, so you wouldn't actually be able to get into shape. But those will eventually return after eating. So kind of the process we take is what we call the quote-unquote recovery diet, wherein, say, a 1-2 month period, we're trying to get our athlete back to 5 to 10% over stage weight. So that's an aggressive surplus, while reducing, cardio, and we start moving from, okay, let's just track protein and calories, to, okay, let's just track calories and make sure you hit a minimum kind of protein thing, and let's weigh in slightly less, and okay, now we're 10% over stage weight. Let's start dialing back the constraints even more. Let's, weigh in every other day, and then let's, just make sure that our body weight is trending the direction we want. So it's that kind of steady reversal of not only body weight, but also that steady reversal of a lot of the constraints that we had to ensure that you could actually, reach the mission goal. And now it's about trying to return to normalcy. And, okay, we used to only eat out once per month during prep. Now you can eat out as many times as you want, so long as, body weight isn't gained too quickly. And I think so long as there's still some guidance there in the initial stages where hunger is still going to be quite high and the new behaviors are a little intimidating, most people do pretty well with that.
Yeah, I like the framework of that, where you're thinking about, okay, here's, the end point of where you want to be. We don't want you to get to 20% over, like you were saying, 5 to 10%, and then kind of loosening the amount of constraints, right? So I think of it as that the better their appetite can match their calories, as a simple example, they're going to be closer to that endpoint, and they get sort of quote-unquote rewarded by possibly not having to track as much, right? So if you've got an athlete who maybe you're doing a weigh-in Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and they're not really tracking much of anything, writing it down, but they're still maybe keeping track in their head, everything feels pretty good, you still have that marker of having their weight to make sure they don't get, too far off the reservation there. Is that kind of a correct summary?
No, that's a really good summary. That's exactly right. I think when you've tracked your macros on a daily basis for 6 to 8 months, you tend to think like, you almost get these kind of weird thoughts like, well, did I even eat it if I didn't track it? Like if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, did it fall? And it's like, yes, it did, And I think understanding that all those habits that you ingrained and quantified for 6 months are still going to be there if you just kind of go back to your normal ways. And if we do that in an incremental fashion and allow your satiety signals to return and actually start using them as a way, like you said, for them to kind of match our energy balance targets, which if you're eating in a mindful way and, an appropriate spread of foods and you're not short on micronutrients, short on fiber, or short on protein, most of the time you're going to find that they will be pretty close. And then it's a matter of, if we aren't gaining weight, as we look at those, like you said, those 3 weigh-ins per week and kind of looking at the average over 2 week periods, if we're not gaining that, 0.5% of our body weight every 2 to 3 weeks, then we just make sure we're a little fuller after each meal. And if we're gaining too quickly, we just kind of stop a little short of that, make sure we're more satisfied, do some little behavior modifications, like, okay, I got to drink a full glass of water before I actually dig into my meal, or maybe I'll try to increase my fruit and vegetable content, things like that, that should result in a more passive behavioral control of energy intake. Either way, eating more energy dense or energy sparse foods as a way of modifying total intake without actually getting out the scale or the food scale, I should say, is kind of the way I like to go. And then only really tracking things if needed, because some people are going to need it for longer or less, whether they're a first-time competitor or a fifth-time competitor.
Perfect. It's a little bit more anecdotal question, and maybe there's some research on it that I haven't seen that I'm sure you'd be up to date on. Thoughts about people who follow, let's just take someone who's competing because they've got a hard date, and they're on the more extreme end of the spectrum, which I always think is more interesting to learn from the extremes, right? The extremes kind of inform the means. Do you find that people who compete have a more flexible approach, say, going into their show, that their recovery and everything after their show is better compared to someone who is almost very hyper strict and not really using a flexible approach?
I would say yes. And
I would
anecdotally,
agree, but
yeah. So anecdotally, I've definitely seen that the more rigid and the more stressed out and the more anal retentive the person is, and the more they worry over every variable, typically the poorer the output is afterwards. The more that they've restrained themselves so much that they're ready to just cut loose afterwards. And I would say, if you were to look at 3DMJ practices, there was a point when we started regularly including diet breaks, regularly doing 2-day refeeds per week instead of, like, say, 1 day, and also taking a recovery diet approach to where we would try to intentionally gain weight, kind of like the description I gave, versus that more old school, well, not that old school, but the more kind of measured and tracked, quote-unquote, reverse diet, where you're adding small amounts of calories each week to try to maintain leanness, which I think is a bad idea. We've seen much better periods after the diet's over. And that goes hand in hand with, I talked about the flexible dieting versus, rigid dieting, which is really about the type of restraint you have. It goes hand in hand with the research in that it's not just, hey, these two groups exist, but there's big differences between them. So when you have someone who scores high on rigid restraint, they're typically higher in body weight. They're typically more stressed out. They have a higher incidence of eating disorder, body image dissatisfaction. And when they lose weight, they're more prone to binge eating and then rebounding. And all those things are less in people with a flexible dieting mindset. So basically, people with a flexible dieting mindset seem to be correlated more with, I can lose weight, I am lighter, I can keep it off, and I'm not stressed out as much by that process, and I have a healthy relationship with both food and my body. So I think it's borne out pretty well, both in the research and in practice. Awesome.
And you had mentioned that you are not a fan of adding, say, smaller amounts of carbohydrates, just to pick one group, over a prolonged period of time in a sort of classic reverse dieting protocol?
I'm not a fan of it straight out the gates, because if you think about it, if you were dieting all the way,
more restrictive again, just the other direction.
Exactly. Yeah. And from if you want to put it in really, really basic terms, like if you just finish the diet and you add, let's say 10 grams of carbohydrate and cut out one cardio session, you're still in a deficit. So you're still dieting. So typically what it looks like for us, that quote-unquote recovery diet, is if you were eating, let's say, an average of 2,200 calories a day and you're doing 4 cardio sessions, we'll take you down to 2 cardio sessions and you'll be up to like 2,700 calories immediately, So that should put you out of a deficit into a surplus. And if it doesn't, then we make a big jump the next week too. Let's add another 250 calories, because I actually want to see you within, 4 to 8 weeks gaining 5 to 10% of your body weight again. So that means we're looking to gain weight visibly each week. Because being, what I try to tell my competitors is like, look, you're a bodybuilder. Having, glutes that look like a rib cage is not conducive to gaining muscle. Trust me. So actually getting to the low end of that set point, getting a male competitor from, let's say, 5% body fat to 10% body fat rather expediently, you're still going to look great. You're going to be at the low end of the range of what you can probably maintain without being hungry. Maybe still a little hungry for many people. But that's a great place to then slow down and take that more measured approach. So I'm fine with that, adding 5 to 20 grams of carbs, every couple weeks approach after you've put on that body fat as you're making these small adjustments, because it all comes down to what is the amplitude of change you're looking for over what time period. So if I want to gain 5% of your body weight over a month, that's more than the 1% change per week. Yeah, we're going to make big numbers change, right? The reverse diet approach doesn't make sense. But now once I've done that, and now I want to see 1% of your body weight change per month, yeah, I either need to make small changes or very infrequent changes. So we kind of do a little bit of both. And that's when I think that slow, more measured, gradual kind of shift in calories upwards makes sense based on what's happening after you put on that big chunk of weight initially and got to kind of the low end of your settling point.
Very cool. Do you think part of that is also trying to, maybe ameliorate's not the right word, but buffer the massive amount of stress that they've had to endure, borderline, overtraining, things of that nature, to get to the point that they were at such a low level that you're basically trying to minimize that time on the back end?
So, which part of what? If you could just clarify that question a little more, make sure I understand it.
By taking a more shorter approach as to sort of, instead of prolonging that over 3 to 4 months, right? Where you said the recovery diet, we're actually looking to try to be a little bit more aggressive and get people back from that maybe 5% to 10% in a shorter period of time as opposed to a longer period of time. Or is it just simply a time thing where you've got 6 months to work with? Well, if I can get you back to, say, 10% and then take a more measured approach, I've now got, 4 to 5 months I can work on trying to build you up a little bit more.
Oh, it's definitely both. So, I mean, if you were to look at the research on why do people go crazy from dieting, it's not just that, people who have eating disorders diet and, one causes the other and they have problems. It also becomes this feedback loop. So if you were to take mentally healthy people and diet them down to the stage-length conditions that bodybuilders reach, many of them would start to exhibit what we would diagnose as an eating disorder. Mm-hmm. So there's some of that's a biological drive to become super hungry, super food focused, and develop rituals around food so that you actually eat. Yeah.
Minnesota starvation study is the most well documented case of that at the extremes.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And there's some wacky stuff that happened in the Minnesota semi-starvation study.
2 of them people got checked into a mental ward.
That's right. And then 2 became professional chefs afterwards.
Yes.
So all kinds of crazy stuff happened in that study, and you see parallels in bodybuilders for sure. And one of the things that is used as a treatment for anorexics is whatever we need to do to get you to actually start eating, that's step 1. Because while it doesn't eliminate the original mental pathology that got you there, it turns the volume down on all of it. Just getting you actually into a surplus, gaining some body fat, can make it so that there's some possibility of moving forward. Because now you're not having that biological and psychological strain. So that's a huge part of it too. Simply overfeeding the person for a period kind of gets them back to a place of sanity. That really helps. And things that didn't make sense. Sorry, things that made sense but really don't. Even a month ago, you can now go, wow, why was I doing that? Like I was, I thought that blending whey protein powder, Splenda, and like 2 teaspoons of water and eating that was delicious. And now I'm like, why would I even do that? I thought that using a full bottle of Walden Farms a week was normal. That's not normal, So all those little behaviors starts to disappear. Or at least they get less, which is very important. And like you said, it's just not conducive to building muscle to be adding tiny little amounts of food and staying in this, hormonally suppressed state where your body fat is that low. That's not, if you can't even wake up as a male who's 25 and have, morning wood, it's unlikely that you have great muscle building potential right now. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So just getting someone back to functioning normally, sleeping through the night, having a normal libido, and not being so food focused that it's all I think about during the day, and I don't see the Food Network as titillating cinematic experience. Once you can get into that point, that's when they can actually start physiologically putting on muscle mass more effectively, but B, being a saner, happier human. So it's definitely both.
Gotcha. And last question on this, and we'll segue more back to research on flexible dieting. But you had mentioned you use some questionnaires and things of that nature. Do you use like heart rate variability or other things in an attempt to try to quantify the amount of stress that people have gone under for competition?
No, and I would actually I'm always curious on your take on that, because I know you have a lot more experience. The subjective stuff we do. So sometimes I will get session RPE in the times I can't control for someone's training. So session RPE, real briefly, it's unlike the RPE that most people are familiar with me talking about. That's based on Mike T's work. The other Mike T, excuse me.
Mike Toucher.
Yeah, right. Based on repetitions and reserve, but rather it's an aggregate score. So 15 minutes after you finish your workout, let's say you're doing your cool down, you finish your cool down, you go, how hard was that whole workout out of 10? And then if it's an endurance session, you multiply that by minutes. And then if it was a strength training session, you can multiply that by the total reps. And then you get this made-up unit of total stress. So that's very useful for me. If I have someone who I don't get to control their training, I at least have a quantitative score of what was their training stress load. And then if I see like, oh wow, I'm pushing them really hard with the diet at the same time as their coach or they themselves are pushing them with nutrition, and they're struggling mentally and physically, and I'm seeing the weigh-ins are jumping up all over the place, this is probably a period where I want to give them a diet break or ease off the gas pedal or something like that. And on the other side of it, when I have a client who is either not that self-aware or just not that good at being a communicative client, like when they give me the subjective reports that I ask for weekly, it's a 2-sentence check-in. Yeah, all's good, training hard, coach. Let me know if there's any changes. Like,
yeah,
you think you're being a good soldier, but at the same time, I don't know anything about what's going on. So, and I'm telling them, hey, give me a video recording of your face and talk for 5 to 10 minutes, and only write an email if you're having trouble with upload speeds. And I get that same 2-sentence email every time. That's when I start busting out the extra page in their Excel sheet that has sleep quality 1 to 5, libido 1 to 5, irritability 1 to 5, and I have a 5 or 6. We modify it depending on the client and depending on the situation, and then I can kind of look at that kind of average across those scores week to week to week, and that becomes the replacement for that subjective data. But I actually prefer the subjective data to give me an indication of where they're at a little bit better.
Yeah, I mean, my quick 2 cents, which could be a whole nother podcast, is that I use HRV, and then I use in the app, it's the iFleet app, they also rate, was similar to what you were saying, energy, nutrition, sleep, all that kind of stuff, because I think there's a tendency to say, ooh, this is, a hard number, but I want to know the context of what that number was generated in, right? Because HRV could be moved because they had an argument with their spouse before they went to train. It could have nothing to do with the training, but that's still a very high stressor on them. And I've done it in a handful of physique competitors, more so in some competitive lifters. And physique competitors was interesting because in the handful of people I've done it, you'll see them get super stressed and almost become very sort of parasympathetic right before a show, because their body is just heart rate plummets. all that kind of stuff happens. And then my little marker I have for them is that until that gets back to the normal, right? Because I've got a nice baseline before we started doing your prep. I don't really want you to even think about another show unless you're telling me it's at least a year out, right? Because I don't want you to think that you can do another show in 6 months. And I'm looking at all this stress that you haven't been able to replace yet, in essence, right? They're not even, like you're saying with body weight, right? You're thinking about homeostasis. You're thinking about, okay, can I at least get your autonomic nervous system back to somewhat of a happy baseline? Because I can absolutely guarantee your following prep is going to suck, right? You're not going to be able to do much training. You're not going to be able to accumulate much volume. You're going to feel like crap, and all those things are associated with it. So, yeah. It
makes a lot of sense, and I think that parallels exactly what I do, just with different metrics.
Yeah, same idea.
So yeah. Totally.
Cool. So a couple of final questions. I know we've mentioned this a little bit as we've gone out, different research on flexible dieting. But if you could give us a short kind of recap on, just in general, what does the research say on that, and any particular
Mike, cut out there for just a second.
Oh, yeah, if you could just give us a short little recap on some of the research on flexible dieting, and just kind of any of the things people should kind of watch out for.
Sure. Yeah, I think you asked for a short recap.
Yes.
My sound's coming through good because you kind of just cut in and out there. But yeah, so moreover, the kind of the big bird's eye view of the research on flexible dieting started in the late 90s and really was all correlational based research. So kind of looking at basically taking the scale of restraint that already existed in this eating questionnaire and then dividing into two different categories. Flexible restraint and rigid restraint, and then looking at correlations between people who scored high on one or the other. So again, started in the late 90s, and they started to consistently see that people who scored high on rigid restraint had all those same issues. So higher incidence of eating disorder, higher incidence of body dissatisfaction, binge eating during diets, higher body weight at baseline, and then also weight regain after a diet is over. And there's not been a ton of actual controlled trials where they take an approach to either one, but there have been a few. Interestingly enough, there was one in 2012 by Luria Cohen where they essentially took two diets with one being a little more rigid, where they said, hey, here's the same quantitative values for calories and macronutrients, but one group you're not allowed to eat bread. Just an example of just annoying your participants and just making it harder on one person. And in that study, the group that wasn't allowed to eat bread had more dietary transgressions, means they went off the diet more frequently, and they had a higher number of dropouts. That's kind of the basic finding of, we just made the diet harder, but the weight loss among those who completed the diet wasn't any greater by removing bread. It just made it suck. And then a really recent study that came out just I think last week was basically an if it fits your macros versus meal plan study that just popped up. And they found that in the group, in women who followed an if it fits your macros approach, and this makes sense if you think about the total calorie intake women take in, they had, I believe, and I'm paraphrasing off of just having skimmed this recently, they had more incidences of not meeting their nutrient adequacy levels for vitamins and minerals, which is interesting. So the meal plan was not variable enough. It was too limited, interestingly. So that can happen both ways, though, depending on what you do with if it fits your macros. But there are problems with being super rigid. And that's kind of paralleled by a lot of the 80s and 90s research on bodybuilders when I would say clean eating was at its height. When you look at bodybuilders pre-prep in the middle of, pre-competition in the middle of the hardest part of their prep, they're very consistently short of about 5 or 6 micronutrients, both minerals and vitamins. Probably because the food list that they're choosing from is, a very sparse number of items.
You mean chicken breast and tilapia and broccoli and asparagus won't save me from everything?
Fish and a rice cake is not a balanced diet.
Luckily, I haven't seen as many of horrible diet plans in the last couple of years, but going back about 4 to 5 years ago, and sadly it was more in the women's area, where if I saw one more diet and training plan that said eat tilapia and asparagus and train 4 to 5 days a week between 4 to 5 sets of 10 to 15 repetitions, I was going to launch myself off a cliff somewhere. So
yeah, that's like the grinder approach. Like, this will definitely put you at a deficit, and you'll be lifting weights, and if you survive, you'll probably look at least acceptable. And I'm a terrible coach, and I give this to everybody. But I know I'll get some champions, and I'll post them on Instagram and nobody else.
Yep. It's kind of what I call the Bulgarian method for physique competition.
Exactly. Yes, it's the grind them up and spit them out, and the champions will be the ones who can make it through.
Yep. And the hard part is that you end up with the people who do make it through, who've got just crazy genetics or willingness to torture themselves or whatever. And they can honestly say, okay, here's what I did. And then sadly everybody goes, oh, but so-and-so did it, and look at them. It's like, oh, no.
Mm-hmm. Yep. But you don't see all the broken people who are now going to be taking years to get back to a kind of normal baseline health and psychology before they'll ever compete again, if they decide to,
Yep. Yeah, and that's kind of the handful of people I work with that are in that subpopulation of got either metabolism kind of hosed up or mechanically broken, overuse injuries, all the kind of funky stuff. But it makes it interesting. So
yeah, and we get a lot of people who come to us, and their off-season numbers look like a hard part of their diet. Where we put them. Yeah, and that's when you gotta go, well, hold on, let's postpone this competition and just get you back to some place that resembles healthy.
Yeah. Cool. So if you were to give 30 seconds and write an ad for why flexible dieting is better, what would you say?
I'd say, flash, flexible dieting beats rigid dieting every time. No, I would say,
That's pretty good.
I would say that, thank you, I appreciate it, if it was 1952.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I would say that having a structured approach to flexibly dieting can help you diet for the length of time needed to reach the goals that most people have, whether that is just a lifestyle change and you are looking to move from overweight or obese to having eventually, a healthy body fat level, but more hopefully just ingraining healthy habits. You need to be able to sustain that. So just focusing on sustainability of a diet is critical for any goal, whether that is getting on stage or whether that's just changing your lifestyle and being healthier. So a rigid diet is just simply something that people can't stick to. It's not a long-term solution. So really commit to your goals and think of, can I do this in the long haul? And that's really what I think the essence of flexible dieting is.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Helms. I greatly appreciate it. And if people want to hunt you out, where's the best way, and how would they get in contact with you and plug whatever else you got going on?
Well, thank you for having me, and definitely check us out at 3dmusclejourney.com. That's probably the umbrella site for everywhere else. Like that, you can find my links to my ebooks, links to our YouTube channel. We've got 3dmusclejourney.com/mass, where you can find links to signing up for, if you really want to keep nerding out, the research review that myself, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Greg Nuckols do. And you can pretty much find all of our links to everything there, and all our blog articles and our podcast that I'm on in 3 out of 5 episodes or so that's ran by Andrea Valdez. It's a great place to check out anything and all related to me and the 3DMJ team.
Awesome. Yeah, and I would highly encourage people to check everything out there, and I've been a subscriber of Mass since it started, and lots of great information in there too. So awesome.
Honored to hear it.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for taking the time today. I greatly appreciate it, and thanks again.
My pleasure. Thank you.